My name is Jerry Smith, and this story is about my ex-wife, Maria Brown. I won't bore you with the details of how we met or how stunning she looked, though I'll admit she could turn heads effortlessly. What's important to know is that we both graduated from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, a place where ambition thrived, and neither of us was short on it. I specialized in operations, while Maria excelled in marketing. She had this incredible knack for making anything sound appealing, whether it was a product, a new idea, or even just a dinner reservation at a questionable restaurant. After graduation, we both stepped into different worlds. She joined a big-name auto manufacturer, and I took a position at Kirsten Limited, heading software research and sales. We got married 2 years into our careers. It was a small wedding, just close friends and family. Nothing flashy, just the way we both wanted. Maria always said, "Why spend a fortune on one day when we could use it for something that lasts?" That was one of the many things I loved about her back then, her practicality. Work kept us busy, but we managed to carve out time for each other. Weeknights often turned into brainstorming sessions at the dining table. "What do you think about this campaign idea?" Maria would ask, sliding her laptop across to me. "Let me see," I'd reply, scrolling through the slides. "Looks solid, but maybe tweak the tagline? It feels a little too broad." Her eyes would narrow as she stared at the screen. You might be right. Okay, Mr. Operations Guru, I'll rework it." We were a good team, not just at home but also when it came to bouncing ideas off each other. She respected my perspective, and I admired her creativity. After 5 years at the auto manufacturer, though, I began to notice a change in Maria. She wasn't as excited about her job anymore. One evening, as we sat on the couch with takeout boxes balanced on our laps, she let out a long sigh. "What's wrong?" I asked, nudging her with my elbow. "It's work," she said, stabbing a piece of chicken with her fork. "I don't feel like I'm growing there anymore. Every day feels the same, like I'm on autopilot." "Have you talked to your boss about it?" "I tried," she said, her tone tinged with frustration, "but they just throw more of the same projects at me. I want something different, something more challenging." I put my box down and turned to her. "Maybe it's time to start looking for something else." She nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I think you're right. I'll start updating my resume tomorrow." And just like that, Maria began her search for a new path. At the time, I was proud of her for taking the initiative. Little did I know, this would set off a chain of events that would change everything. Here's where my marriage started to go to hell. Maria, to my utter shock, was hired as the new CEO of Kirsten Limited. I remember the day she told me like it was yesterday. We were in the kitchen. I was brewing coffee while she sat at the counter scrolling through her emails. "Jerry," she said, her tone casual, though her face was anything but. "Yeah?" I replied, pouring the hot coffee into a mug. "I have news," she said, looking up with that familiar spark in her eyes. "I got the job." I froze mid-pour. "Wait, what job?" She smiled, and I'll never forget the way her voice carried that mix of pride and excitement. "The CEO position at Kirsten." My stomach dropped. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "The CEO position?" I repeated, trying to mask the shock in my voice. "At Kirsten?" "Yes," she exclaimed, getting up and walking over to me. "Can you believe it? They want me to lead the company, Jerry. I can't even process it fully." I set the coffee pot down and forced a smile. "That's amazing, Maria. Congratulations." And I meant it, at least on the surface. But inside, it felt like someone had punched me in the gut. The CEO position was something I'd quietly been working toward. I had been with Kirsten for years, heading IT sales and research, turning it into the most profitable department for 4 consecutive years. I thought I was in line for the top job, or at least under serious consideration. Still, this was Maria's moment. I wasn't about to ruin it. "I'm proud of you," I said, pulling her into a hug. "You're going to be great." "Thanks," she said softly. "I couldn't have done it without your support." But the reality of it all hit hard the following week. Everyone in the office knew Maria was now the CEO, and it didn't take long for me to feel the ripple effects. The HR team called me into a meeting that Monday morning. "Jerry, as you know, having a spouse as your direct superior can be both a strength and a challenge," the HR manager, Clara, began with a diplomatic smile. "We've seen it work well in some cases and not so well in others." "I understand," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "We're confident you'll be professional about this," Clara continued. "Just keep in mind that the dynamics may shift, and it's important to maintain a clear boundary between work and personal life." "Got it," I said, though I couldn't help but feel like I was being treated like a liability. Reporting to my wife was fine, at first. Awkward, sure, but I was determined to keep things professional. The real problem wasn't Maria or the HR lectures. It was someone she brought with her. Or rather, someone she insisted on bringing with her. Enter Alistair Parker, her assistant. Having Alistair Parker as her assistant was something I could tolerate. But when the HR department informed me that, due to company policy, spouses couldn't report directly to each other, I was told I would have to report to him instead. You'll technically be under Alistair, Clara from HR had explained, but it's just a formality. We understand your dynamic. It didn't feel like a formality. Reporting to Maria's assistant? I could feel my pride taking a hit, but when I brought it up at home, Maria waved it off. It's just on paper, Jerry, she said, resting a reassuring hand on my shoulder. You'll still be working with me directly. This is just to keep HR happy. I wanted to believe her, but things didn't unfold the way she'd painted them. A few weeks later, during a board meeting, I got a shocker that I hadn't seen coming. We've reviewed the company's structure, one of the board members began, glancing at his notes. And in the interest of streamlining operations, we've decided to reassign the IT sales and research department. I sat up straighter in my chair. Reassign? The chairman nodded toward Maria, who took it from there. Effective immediately, the IT sales and research department will be under Alistair Parker's leadership. I felt the air leave the room. My department, my work, was being handed over to Maria's assistant? The chairman continued, oblivious to my growing anger. Jerry, we're asking you to step in and oversee the after-sales support department. It's an area that needs urgent attention, and your leadership could really make a difference there. I barely heard the rest of the meeting. My mind was racing, and my gut instinct was clear. I had to get out. That evening, I typed up my resignation letter and sent it to Alistair. It felt humiliating to email my resignation to someone who had been an assistant just weeks ago, but I couldn't stomach staying under these conditions. When Maria found out, she wasn't happy. You're resigning? She asked, her voice sharp as we sat across from each other at the dining table. Maria, this isn't what I signed up for, I shot back. You've reassigned my department, my years of work, to Alistair. And now you expect me to clean up the mess in after sales? What's the point of staying? She sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose. Jerry, I need you to reconsider. It's not just about you. This would look bad for your career, and it's not great for the company either. Oh, so now you care about what's bad for my career? I snapped. If that were true, you wouldn't have let this happen in the first place. Her voice softened, like she was trying to explain something to a stubborn child. The after-sales department is a disaster. You're the only person I trust to fix it. It's an important role. You could have added it to my workload, I countered. You didn't have to strip me of my department. And that's when she said the words that set me off. Jerry, I needed to give Alistair a department to justify his role to the board. Him being just my assistant wouldn't cut it. I froze, staring at her in disbelief. So, to make your assistant's job secure, you changed my role? You don't sacrifice your best employee to make space for a new one, I told her, my voice steady but laced with bitterness. Especially not for someone who doesn't have the first clue about how to do the job. Maria leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Jerry, stop. This isn't personal. If you insist on leaving, you still have to serve the mandatory 90-day notice period to receive the company's recommendation. Her words hit me like a slap. My own wife, throwing policy at me like I was just another employee. I swallowed the lump of anger rising in my throat and gave her a tight-lipped smile. Sure, Mrs. Smith, I said, emphasizing her title with a deliberate edge. I'll do what's professional. I stood, ignoring the flicker of something. Regret? Frustration? That passed over her face and left her office without another word. The tension at home was unbearable. I could hear Maria in the kitchen, moving dishes around, probably waiting for me to start the conversation. I wasn't going to make it easy for her. Finally, she walked into the living room, her face set in a defensive expression. You're still upset, she said, sitting down across from me. Upset? I scoffed. Maria, you handed my entire career over to someone who's completely unqualified, and now you want me to play nice? Her eyes narrowed. This isn't about playing nice, Jerry. Alistair will learn. The team is strong. They'll manage just fine. Manage? I snapped. The team follows their leader. And with a leader who has no clue what he's doing, they're going to fail. Maria folded her arms. I'll make sure Alistair is trained properly, by you. I laughed bitterly. So now I have to train him? Is that it? He comes and reports to me, and I show him the ropes? No, she said firmly. You'll still report to him, but you'll train him to handle the department. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You want me to report to the guy who took my job, and then train him to do it? Do you hear how absurd that sounds? Jerry, she said, her voice softening, this isn't about you. It's about what's best for the company. Oh, so now I'm not what's best for the company? Your most profitable employee is on a notice period because of your stupid decision, and you talk about what is best for the company, I shot back. You know what? I'll train him, on one condition. You inform the board that this is part of my 90-day notice agreement. Otherwise what? She asked, frowning. Otherwise, for the next 90 days, I'll take your boy Alistair around the company and make sure he learns everything. Everything except his actual job. Her face turned pale, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of real concern. You can't blackmail me like that, Maria shot back, her voice sharp with indignation. Try me, I replied coolly, meeting her glare with unwavering confidence. I'll get another job, Maria, recommendation or not. In fact, I reached for my phone and pulled up my emails, scrolling to the folder I'd prepared earlier. Here, take a look. I turned the screen toward her. Her eyes scanned the messages, and I caught the faintest sound of a gasp as she read through the subject lines. 5 job offers, I said, letting the satisfaction seep into my voice. All paying higher than Kirsten Limited. And guess what? Not a single one of them requires a recommendation from you or anyone else here. Maria's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she was silent, staring at the screen as if it might somehow erase the proof. Now, I continued, sliding the phone back into my pocket. Since you've decided I'm expendable for your boy Alistair, go ahead. Let's see how you explain this to the board when they ask why I resigned. Without waiting for her response, I turned and left the room, my steps firm and deliberate. Over the next 3 days, I threw myself into my new role. I wasn't about to waste my notice period sulking in a corner. Instead, I decided to prove a point, to Maria, to the board, and most importantly, to myself. It didn't take long to figure out the root of the problem in the after-sales department. The issue wasn't with performance. The team wasn't lazy or incompetent. They simply didn't understand the products they were supporting. If you don't know what you're talking about, I told them during one of our morning huddles, how do you expect the customers to trust you? They nodded, some hesitantly, others with visible relief. It was clear they wanted guidance, and I was more than ready to provide it. We're implementing a mandatory training program, I announced. Every employee in this department will undergo training on our latest products. No exceptions. The team buzzed with a mix of apprehension and excitement, but I knew it was the right move. If nothing else, I'd leave Kirsten Limited with this department running better than it had in years. I was reviewing the final arrangements for the training session when my phone buzzed. It was a summons, an email instructing me to report to the conference room immediately. When I arrived, the room was filled with the company's board members. Their faces were serious, their expressions unreadable. And at the head of the table, looking as poised as ever, was my CEO wife. Maria's gaze met mine, and I could see something flicker in her eyes. Was it determination? Frustration? Maybe both. The tension in the room was palpable as Ronald Kirsten, the managing director, leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern. Why have you resigned, Mr. Smith? He asked, his voice steady but clearly searching for answers. You've been with us for such a long time. Why give it up now? I looked directly at him, unflinching. Give me a good reason to stay, I replied. He blinked, momentarily taken aback. The company has been good to you, Mr. Smith, he said after a pause. I couldn't help the slight chuckle that escaped me, though there was no humor in it. Good to me? I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my arms. Out of 13 departments, I was heading the most profitable one, not just for 1 year, but for 4 consecutive years. Yet, I was removed from that position and sent to the one no one else wanted to lead. It could have been a challenge I'd have welcomed, if it was handled properly. But tell me, Mr. Kirsten, if I was as valuable as my record shows, why wasn't I even consulted about the change? Why wasn't it discussed with me? Why not add it to my existing responsibilities instead of stripping me of my role? The silence in the room was deafening. I let my words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Instead, I was asked to give up a department of 100 team members to take over one with just 25. Let me ask you something. Would you give up a larger, successful team to take over a struggling, smaller one, without a conversation or even a choice in the matter? Still, no one said a word. I caught the uneasy looks being exchanged among the board members, their gazes flitting between Ronald and Maria. Maria shifted in her seat and opened her mouth to speak. But before a word escaped, I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. I'm not finished yet, Mrs. Smith, I said firmly, locking eyes with her. I turned my attention back to Ronald. You said this company has been good to me, so let me explain exactly how good it has been recently. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. I was told to report to a man, Alistair Parker, who has less experience than I do, who has never in his life headed a department. His biggest professional achievement so far? Being the assistant to a CEO. And when I resigned, do you know what the company's response was? No one asked me why. No one asked if they could do anything to change my mind. The only thing I was told was to serve the mandatory 90-day notice period. I let the sarcasm drip from my voice as I delivered my final words. Please, Mr. Kirsten, don't treat anyone this good ever again. I could see the uncomfortable shifts and lowered gazes of the board members. Maria's face was taut, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. As I left the conference room, the heavy silence still lingered in my mind. I knew how these meetings played out. Guys like me, those without the big titles or executive clout, rarely came out ahead. The boardroom politics would always favor the higher-ups, and I'd just be another casualty in their power games. But something nagged at me. Why was Maria so determined to elevate Alistair over me? Why risk the department's performance and morale just to place him in a role he wasn't qualified for? The question had crossed my mind before, but I'd been too consumed with work drama to give it the attention it deserved. Now, though, I couldn't shake the thought. There had to be more to this, something deeper. Years of working at the company had taught me one thing. Information is power. And when you've been around as long as I have, you know who to talk to and who's willing to help. I called Ashley, one of my former team members, who'd always been reliable and discreet. We met in the break room, where she kept an eye on the door while we talked in hushed tones. Ashley, I need you to be straight with me, I said, leaning in slightly. What's the deal with Maria and Alistair? I need the truth. Her eyes darted around nervously. Jerry, I don't know if I should. Ashley, please, I interrupted, lowering my voice further. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. You've worked with me long enough to know I wouldn't push if it didn't matter. She sighed, glancing at the door again before leaning in. Look, it's just office gossip, okay? But people have noticed how close Maria and Alistair are. Like, really close. Close how? I asked, narrowing my eyes. She hesitated. Some people think they might be, involved. Romantically. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Romantically? I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. Ashley nodded. They spend a lot of time together behind closed doors. And she's been defending him left and right, even when people question his decisions. It's just unusual. I leaned back, processing what she'd said. If what Ashley hinted at was true, it explained a lot. Maria's insistence on putting Alistair above me, her willingness to risk the department for his sake. But I needed proof. Speculation wasn't enough. That's when I decided to take things to the next level. I needed someone who could dig deeper, someone who could get me the answers I wasn't equipped to find. I called Jake Sullivan, an old friend who worked as a private investigator. Jake had always been a straight shooter, and if anyone could uncover the truth, it was him. Jake, it's Jerry, I said when he picked up. Jerry, long time, man. What's up? I need a favor, I said, skipping the pleasantries. It's sensitive. Can we meet? Sure thing. My office in an hour? Perfect. Thanks, Jake. An hour later, I was sitting across from him, explaining everything. Maria's decisions at work, the rumors about her and Alistair, and my growing suspicions. So, you want me to keep an eye on Maria? Jake asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah. And Alistair, I added. I need to know if there's anything between them, professionally or otherwise. Jake leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin. All right, I can do that. But Jerry, you sure you want to go down this road? I have to, I said firmly. If there's nothing, fine. But if there is, I need to know. Jake nodded. All right, I'll start tonight. And I'll need access to her phone and laptop if we want the full picture. That won't be a problem, I said, an idea forming in my mind. Back at home that night, I waited until Maria was asleep before I made my move. Using a spare USB drive and some tools I'd learned about over the years, I accessed her work laptop and mirrored the data onto the drive. My hands trembled slightly, but I pushed through the nerves. Next, I grabbed her phone, bypassing the lock with a trick Jake had taught me. For a moment, I felt like Ethan Hunt in Mission Impossible, pulling off a covert operation in enemy territory. My heart raced with a mix of anxiety and adrenaline as I worked. After setting up the hack, I messaged Jake to let him know the phone and laptop were ready for his access. My work was done, for now. Exhausted but unable to shake the anxiety coursing through me, I forced myself to lie down. Sleep came in fits, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, I was up early, going through my usual routine. Maria emerged from the bedroom looking cheerful, too cheerful. There was a bounce in her step as she greeted me with a warm smile. "Good morning, Jerry," she said, her voice unusually sweet. "Morning," I replied, raising an eyebrow. Her demeanor was far from the cold indifference I'd gotten used to. Something was up. As I sat down with my coffee, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "I was thinking, maybe you could drive me to work today." I blinked, caught off guard. "You have a company car, Maria. Why would you need me to take you?" She shrugged, her tone light. "I just thought it'd be nice to spend more time with my husband. You know, drive together like old times." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "And when exactly did you come to that realization?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Alistair and I talked about it yesterday. He thinks I should make more effort to spend time with you." I froze for a moment, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. "Oh, so an outsider is now telling you what to do in our marriage?" I set the cup down with deliberate slowness, locking eyes with her. "That's wonderful, Maria. Truly. Do you make business decisions the same way? Some idiot comes and gives you the idea and you follow with it?" Her expression soured instantly, and the sweetness in her voice evaporated. "You? See? I knew you'd ruin this. I told Alistair you have too much pride." I couldn't help but chuckle at that, though it was a bitter sound. "Oh, did you? And what else did you tell Alistair? What I like in bed, what food I like, how my fart smells?" Maria stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sighed and grabbed my briefcase, heading out for the office. For the next 3 days, we barely spoke. She didn't complain, and I didn't bother trying to mend things either. It felt like we were strangers living under the same roof, and the growing void between us was a painful reminder of how far apart we drifted. A small part of me wanted to confront her again, to demand answers, but what was the point? The way things were going, I couldn't shake the thought that I'd already lost her to Alistair. Somehow, he had influence over her, maybe even control. But why? That question lingered, gnawing at me. By the time the fortnightly board meeting rolled around, I had buried my personal troubles under layers of professional focus. This was my chance to show that my efforts in the after-sales department were paying off, that I was still invaluable to this company despite everything. I walked into the boardroom with a presentation that detailed the progress we'd made. The room was filled with the usual faces: Ronald Kirsten, the MD, Maria, my CEO wife, sitting smugly next to Alistair, and the other board members, all looking at me expectantly. Clearing my throat, I began. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to share the results of the training initiative we rolled out last week. As you know, the department was struggling with customer satisfaction metrics, but I'm pleased to report a significant improvement. The Net Promoter Score has risen from 12% to 28% in just 1 week. The room buzzed with murmurs, some nodding in approval. I pressed on, detailing how the training program had been implemented and how employees were now better equipped to handle customer inquiries. But just as I was about to wrap up, Maria interrupted me. "Those numbers are not correct," she said, her voice sharp and cutting through the room like a blade. I stopped mid-sentence, turning to her. "Excuse me?" She leaned forward, her gaze icy. "The NPS has grown, yes, but not to 28%. It's only at 14%. Your data is incorrect, Jerry." I clenched my jaw, holding back the urge to lash out. "Maria, I verified these numbers myself." Before I could continue, Ronald Kirsten raised a hand, cutting me off. "Mr. Smith," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "This has never happened before. Please, double-check your numbers and let's meet again on this matter on Friday." I nodded tightly, swallowing my frustration. "Of course, Mr. Kirsten. I'll have everything ready by then." That night, I packed my belongings and moved out of the bedroom. I couldn't bear the thought of sharing that space with Maria any longer, not after what she'd done. The humiliation, the betrayal, it was all too much. I sat up in the guest room, tossing my things on the bed and letting out a long, frustrated sigh. Maria came home not long after, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked through the house. When she saw the empty space where my things used to be, she stormed into the guest room, her face a mix of anger and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her arms crossed as she stood in the doorway. I got up slowly, my eyes meeting hers. "Maria," I said, my voice cold and steady, "you humiliated me for the last time today, but I promise you, I will return the favor. So be very careful in the next meeting." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. My numbers were correct, I continued, stepping closer. Never in my career have I presented incorrect data. Not once. I don't know what your intention was, but I promise you this. I will get to the bottom of it. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. And since there's clearly nothing left between us as husband and wife, I said, my tone hardening, I see no reason to sleep in the same bed with you anymore. Jerry, this is ridiculous. She snapped. You're overreacting? Overreacting? I interrupted, a bitter laugh escaping me. You may inform your boy Alistair, though. I'm sure he'll be happy to know there's no longer a need for pretense. He's replaced me at the office, after all. I paused, my words heavy with accusation. And I know he will be happy to replace me in our marriage. Then I slammed the door at her face. The next day, I got a call from Jake. His voice was serious, almost grim. Jerry, we need to meet, he said. I've got something you need to see. I agreed, though my gut twisted with anxiety. I met Jake at a quiet cafe, and as soon as I sat down, he slid a folder across the table. Brace yourself, he warned, his expression somber. I opened the folder with trembling hands. What I saw shattered me. Photos and videos of Maria and Alistair, having sex at a motel, kissing outside in the parking, and tangled up in ways no married woman should ever be with another man. My heart sank like a stone, and anger bubbled up in its place. I'm sorry, Jerry, Jake said quietly, his hand on my shoulder. You deserve better than this. I couldn't speak for a moment, my throat tight with rage and heartbreak. Finally, I managed to croak out, I didn't think she'd actually… I suspected, but this… Jake nodded, his expression hardening. You can't let her get away with this, Jerry. Here. He handed me a business card. Kelly Lawson. She's the best divorce lawyer in the city, an absolute shark. You're gonna need her. I stared at the card for a moment before slipping it into my pocket. Thanks, Jake, I muttered, my voice hollow. Jake leaned in closer, his voice low and firm. Wreck her, Jerry. Don't let her walk all over you. I nodded, though the fire in my chest felt like it was about to consume me. That night, I couldn't go back home. I was afraid of what I might do if I saw Maria. I checked into a dingy motel instead, tossing and turning all night as my thoughts raced. Her betrayal played on an endless loop in my mind, and with every passing hour, my resolve hardened. By morning, I had made up my mind. In the next meeting, I'd make her pay. When I arrived at the office, I avoided Maria completely. I wasn't ready to face her, not yet. My focus was on the meeting, on keeping my composure, and on setting the stage for what I planned to do next. Friday finally arrived, and I made sure to be in the conference room 5 minutes early. The air felt thick with tension as I walked in and saw Maria sitting beside her boy, Alistair, both of them waiting for me. Her eyes met mine, and she immediately asked, "Why haven't you been home for the last 3 days?" I paused for a moment, then tilted my head slightly. "Is that a question for me, Mrs. Smith?" I asked coldly. She sighed, clearly annoyed. "Yes, Jerry. Where were you?" I leaned back in my chair and smirked. "Is that your question, Mrs. Smith? Or does your assistant here want to know where I've been?" Before she could respond, Alistair shot up from his chair, anger written all over his face. "Be respectful, Jerry," he snapped. I turned my gaze to him slowly, letting my words drip with venom. "Or else what, Mr. Parker? If you're trying to threaten me, I'd be more than happy to take this conversation outside the office." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Are you man enough to do that, Mr. Parker? Are you?" The room went silent for a moment, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I could see the color drain from his face as he hesitated, his confidence faltering. Before anything else could unfold, Mr. Kirsten walked in with the rest of the board members. He had a cheerful air about him, his mood contrasting sharply with the tension in the room. "Oh, everyone's here already," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. He glanced at me with a raised brow. "So, Mr. Smith, are the numbers correct this time?" I smiled, cool and composed, leaning forward slightly as I replied, "Sure, Mr. Kirsten. This time, I have everything in place." I began my presentation, standing confidently as I explained that the NPS had now risen to 29%, a significant jump from the previous 14%. My words were clear, backed by carefully laid out slides, and I could sense the room's attention on me. But, predictably, Maria interrupted. "The numbers are wrong," she declared, her voice sharp. Before Mr. Kirsten could respond, I raised my hand to stop him. "Hold on, Mr. Kirsten," I said firmly, keeping my gaze locked on Maria. "It would be unwise to say anything until I've finished." Mr. Kirsten hesitated for a moment, then slowly sank back into his chair, signaling for me to proceed. I turned to the screen and said, "Let's clear up any doubts right now." With that, I navigated to the live NPS portal, downloading the raw data for the past 2 months. In front of everyone, I performed the calculation step by step, making a direct comparison that clearly validated my numbers. When I finished, I looked straight at Maria, who seemed to be growing visibly uncomfortable. "Care to explain, Mrs. Smith, the supposed error in my calculations? Or, in case you can't find a fault, would you mind explaining how the CEO of this company could have such disastrously incorrect data?" Her composure cracked, her face pale as she glanced around the room. I could see her struggling to find words, but before she could respond, she turned to Alistair, her last refuge. "Did you check the numbers before giving them to me?" He froze, his face unreadable, but his silence was deafening. I leaned back and smirked. "Oh, so it was Mr. Parker," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "who gave you the numbers." I turned my gaze toward Alistair, leveling him with a sharp look. "Mr. Parker," I began, my voice calm but dripping with contempt, "you're heading the most profitable department in this company, and yet you don't know how to perform simple calculations? That's not just embarrassing, it's dangerous." The room was silent, all eyes darting between Alistair and me. I let the tension hang for a moment before turning to Mr. Kirsten. "Now, Mr. Kirsten," I continued, "I never doubted the incompetence of Mr. Parker. He's been proving it quite effectively, but what I fail to understand is how you could hire a CEO who is so utterly out of her depth that she hangs on to an incompetent man like he's some kind of designer handbag. How can you, as the managing director, stay quiet while your most profitable department is tanking, sales are nosediving, and overall research productivity is crumbling under this leadership?" The color drained from Maria's face, but I wasn't finished. I turned back to her, my voice sharpening. "And as for you, Madam CEO, since it seems you're blinded by whatever sparkle Mr. Parker brings to your life, let me present you with the cold, hard facts." I opened the sales portal and projected the numbers onto the screen for everyone to see. The downward trend was unmistakable, as stark as a train wreck in slow motion. "Sales have plummeted by 13%, I said, my tone cutting through the room like a knife. "And the overall research productivity? Down by 53%. Gasps rippled across the room, the board members exchanging shocked glances. "At this rate," I continued, "the research department will have to shut down by December. And by July, the sales figures will dip into negative territory, taking this company's profitability with them." I turned back to Maria. She was now visibly sweating, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. I took a deep breath, scanning the room before speaking, my voice steady and cold. "Now, I'm sure everyone is asking the proverbial question. Why is Madam CEO so blinded by Mr. Incompetent here?" Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Alistair's expression turned defensive. "Well, allow me to answer that question for you." I reached over to my laptop, opened the media file, and hit play. The room fell silent as the screen filled with a video. Maria and Alistair caught having sex, an undeniable act of betrayal. Gasps erupted around the room, and Mr. Kirsten's cheerful expression hardened into one of shock and outrage. When the video ended, I closed the laptop with deliberate calm and turned to Mr. Kirsten. "So, reporting to a spouse is a big no, but screwing your assistant is perfectly acceptable? Is that correct, Mr. Kirsten?" His face was crimson, his mouth opening and closing without forming words. "The way I see it, Mr. Kirsten," I continued, "Madam CEO used her position and influence to manipulate this board into removing me from the most successful department in this company and installing her lover as the head of it. Did Madam CEO happen to mention to this esteemed board that she wanted me to train my so-called boss to do my job?" I paused, scanning the room as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. "I guess she didn't." Turning to the screen once more, I pulled up the financial figures and pointed to the glaring losses. "So, here's the result. I took over one of the worst performing departments and turned it around. Meanwhile, Madam CEO and her incompetent assistant have led this company to losses of $2.5 million in sales and revenue in just 3 weeks." I straightened up and folded my arms, letting the weight of the numbers and the betrayal sink in. "I hereby rest my case." The silence was deafening, the room thick with tension. Then I added, "Now, I had planned to complete my 90-day notice period, but given the circumstances, the fact that this company's CEO attempted to destroy both my career and my reputation, I will be leaving effective immediately." I placed my laptop down on the table and slid it across. "The IT department can pick this up from here." Without another word, I turned to Alistair, who was glaring at me from his seat. I stepped forward, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "And this is my punch-out." I threw a single, calculated punch that connected squarely with his jaw, sending him stumbling back. The room erupted in shocked cries as Alistair clutched his face, and I calmly adjusted my tie. Then I turned to Maria, who was frozen in place, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. "The divorce papers will be served to you in your office, Mrs. Smith," I said, my voice as sharp as a blade. "And don't bother coming home. I've already sent your things to your boy toys place." I pivoted back to Mr. Kirsten, locking eyes with him as I delivered my final blow. "And as for you, Mr. Kirsten, I'll be suing this company for failing to enforce the fraternization clause. Have a nice day." With that, I straightened my shoulders, turned on my heel, and walked out of the conference room, leaving behind stunned silence and shattered egos. The day Maria was served the divorce papers at the office, I made it a point to stay clear of her. I didn't need to see her reaction to know it had crushed her. That same afternoon, Mr. Kirsten was handed the lawsuit papers. He looked as if the weight of the world had landed on his shoulders. Good. It was about time he faced the consequences of his inaction. A couple of hours later, he called me into his office. His tone was no longer commanding but pleading. "Jerry," he began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "let's be reasonable here. The company doesn't need this kind of publicity. How about we make you an offer? We'll drop everything. No hard feelings. And, well, you take the CEO spot. Effective immediately." I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "Mr. Kirsten, you think I want to take Maria's chair? To sit where she sat, knowing what this company allowed her to do? No, thank you. I have no interest in cleaning up the mess you all let happen." "All right," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "How about damages? We'll offer you $5 million to drop the lawsuit." I leaned back in my chair, pretending to consider it. "Not interested yet. Let's see how things play out. I'll get back to you when I'm ready." For the next 7 months, I kept the negotiations going, never committing but always keeping the pressure on. I knew I had them exactly where I wanted. Meanwhile, Maria and I went through the motions of divorce. She tried to fight at first, but there was no room for negotiation. Eventually, she gave up. When the divorce was finalized, our assets remained untouched. I didn't want her money or anything else from her. I just wanted her out of my life. Once the divorce was settled, I finally called Mr. Kirsten. "All right," I said over the phone, "Mr. Kirsten, I started my career with you. So, you deserve some respite from me. I'll take $2 million to drop the lawsuit. Nothing more, nothing less." "Done," he replied, relief evident in his voice. And just like that, it was over. Maria disappeared from my life completely. Last I heard, she'd taken a job as the head of marketing for a small company in Dubai. As for Alistair, his fall was even more satisfying. Maria kicked him to the curb not long after the boardroom incident. Now, he's working as a sales rep for a toothpaste company. I almost feel bad for the guy. Almost. As for me, I moved to Singapore and took on a new role as CEO of a growing tech company. I've thrown myself into my work, avoiding relationships altogether. I'm not bitter, just focused. Life is good. Dear listeners,